Hey, so welcome everybody to Church Now Conversations. I'm Larry Dornbos. I'm Director of Vibrant Congregations, and our work is to help churches take fresh steps in ministry and mission. And we're just really pleased to be able to sponsor Church Now Conversations along with the Center for Church Renewal, Pastor Church Resources, Luminex, Resonate Global Mission, Resonate Church Planting, and Pillar Church. And the goal of these gatherings is to hear voices, all kinds of different voices about what they see going on in the church at this moment that leaders in our congregations need to know about. Just a couple of notes for you this morning. We are actually going to start a conversation/discussion group around Kristin's book, Jesus and John Wayne. And if you're interested in joining that group, there's going to be a link in the chat that you can follow to sign up for that. Or there'll also be a link when the recording comes out and you can sign up that way. For the first 10 people who sign up, you get the book free. So if you're interested in that, we just encourage you to grab the link in the chat or to pick up the link when it comes out with the recording, which will come out in a few days. Also want to ask you to watch for an email that's going to come from us, from Vibrant, around something called Renovations. Renovations is a creative effort by the RCA to help churches gather the best of their treasured traditions and bring them into the future. And Vibrant, in partnership with Renovations, is going to hold a roundtable conversation, one towards the end of April, one at the beginning of May. You can catch that information and sign up for it in the email that's coming out in the next couple of days. So we're looking forward to that conversation with Renovations as well. Just a couple other things along the way, just kind of housekeeping details. We ask that you keep yourself muted during the conversation so that we don't get all kinds of bounce back and feedback and those kind of things. There's going to be an opportunity for questions, and we ask that you put those in the chat, and myself and my teammate Daniel will be working through those and passing those on to Kristin. So if you have questions, pop those in the chat. And the way this is going to work today, for those of you who are new to this, we basically do about a 20-25 minute time when Kristin will talk to us about what she sees going on in the church right now. Then there will be about 15-20 minutes for questions, and then about a 5-10 minute wrap up with Kristin for her to be able to give some last words to us as we are sent on our way. But with that, we are just excited to have Kristin Cobes-Dumais with us today. Kristin is the author of 2 books, A New Gospel for Women, which also is also excellent. I've got both of them on my Kindle. So they're really great books. And the other one is more known to many people. It's Jesus and John Wayne. And that has stirred a lot of conversation in evangelical circles. Kristin is also a history professor at Calvin University. And Kristin, we are just thrilled to have you here today. And I'm going to pass it off to you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Larry. And thank you for this invitation. It really is a privilege to be with you here today on at least what is in West Michigan, a gorgeous summery day. So I was asked to speak on what is happening in the church today. And I should identify that I'm entering into this conversation as a historian, and as a historian, particularly of white evangelicalism. And so my comments will be focused on that, but I'll branch out a little bit as well. And I'll make some direct applications to folks in the RCA and CRC too, because we could have a long conversation of whether RCA and CRC count as evangelical. And of course, it all depends on how you define your terms. But I wanted to start thinking by thinking about the church first. The church is, of course, global, right? And it's good to keep that in mind. So when we're thinking about the state of the church today, even though I'm going to be focusing on the U.S. church and the white conservative evangelical church in particular, or the white evangelical church in particular, we're part of a broader body of Christ, both historically and then also globally. And within this country, the United States, I know we have many Canadians here as well. We need to understand that the church is multiracial as well. Now, wherever you situate yourself, you tend to think of yourself at the center, or at least most of us do, right? And this may actually be especially true of white evangelicals, to kind of see themselves as the center, even as the default church. On the one hand, at least in this culture, whiteness makes that more possible. But also, evangelicals have a kind of self-understanding as kind of seeing themselves as generic Christians, as Bible believing Christians. So much so that many evangelicals don't actually predominantly identify as evangelical. If you ask them, they'll just say, I'm a Christian, right? That's all that needs to be said. Or maybe a little bit more specifically, a Bible believing Christian, as if that speaks for itself. But white evangelicalism isn't just generic Christianity. And evangelical values are not solely based on the Bible. They're also shaped by historical circumstances and by political and cultural allegiances. And that really is the story that I am telling in this book, Jesus and John Wayne. Now, a couple of caveats first. This is actually true of all Christians. It's true of all of us, right? That we are all historically and culturally situated. This is how we are created. God made us this way. We are created and we live in a particular historic moment. We live in a particular social setting, and this is the way we are created to be. We are culturally embedded creatures, and that's okay. And we respond to a God who is outside of time. But some people are more aware of the ways in which their own histories shape their beliefs. So in the United States, for example, take the Black Protestant tradition. There tends to be a much higher awareness of understanding their faith tradition as somewhat distinctive, as something shaped by their historical and cultural experiences. They don't see themselves as just default Christians. Now, I happen to be Dutch Christian Reformed, and deeply so. My mom was an immigrant from the Netherlands. I grew up in Sioux Center, Iowa. My dad was a professor of theology at Dordt. I grew up immersed in a very distinctively Reformed Christian community. And so I was actually very aware of that distinctive identity. I never thought of myself as just plain Christian. I thought of myself as the best and smartest Christians of Christians, right? That was kind of but I understood that it was really quite distinctive. But again, white evangelicalism has this tendency to think of, to not think in terms of traditions as much. And to think that their beliefs are just straight out of the scriptures, right? It almost exist outside of history, timeless, eternal. And it's not that they don't tell histories of their own, but their histories tend to be more about how they have faithfully stewarded these eternal teachings through the ages. So there'll be institutional histories or histories of great evangelists, right? Kind of heroes of the faith, great leaders, or again, their organizations. And many of the histories that evangelicals consume are histories written by evangelicals themselves that are meant to be edifying, that are meant to put the best face forward, and often that are intended to witness, and at the very least, not to tarnish the witness of the church. Now, in my book, as perhaps the subtitle suggests, I tell a different kind of history of white evangelicalism. It's a more critical history, and it's a history that situates evangelical beliefs within their historical context. One of the things I try to do in that book, which is something that most of us historians do in our work, it goes with the territory, is to show how much things have changed over time. This is a really important point because we can show how many religious beliefs and values uh, actually change over time, values that are considered to be kind of timeless or eternal. So one of the things that I did in my book, which is focusing on gender, particularly on masculinity and the links between Christian masculinity and militarism in particular, I looked back to the 19th century just briefly in order to show how there was a time when the dominant conception of Christian manhood was one of self-restraint, a gentlemanly demeanor, which is very different to a more different from a more aggressive kind of militant conception of Christian masculinity that emerges in the early 20th century, although there were precursors in the American South before then. I also show how, for example, Christian nationalism is not a given, even when it comes to conservative American Protestantism. So I showed how this belief that America is a Christian nation and needs to be defended as such was actually a pretty widely accepted belief among liberal Protestants in the early 20th century. And it was a fairly contested belief among many conservative Protestants in the early 20th century. Some, like Billy Sunday, gung-ho Christian nationalists, defend Christian America, World War I. Literally, he climbs atop his pulpit and waves an American flag kind of thing, right? Conservative Protestants were militaristic and Christian nationalists, but not all. There were many conservative Protestants at that same time that said, it's impossible for America to be a Christian nation. I mean, first of all, just look around you. It's not looking super Christian, but also, what is it to be a Christian? It means to have your soul saved. A nation doesn't have a soul, so that's just ridiculous. And so we shouldn't act as such. And many conservative Protestants in the First World War were actually pacifists as well. Liberal Protestants were more likely to be militaristic. And so these are the kind of destabilizing histories that help us to or should help us ask the questions, well, if that was then, how did we get to where we are now? Right, so that's one of the things that history does for us. So in my book, I tell the story of how white evangelicals came to hold a variety of cultural values and political values in addition to their theological beliefs. And for the story I tell, the Cold War era is really critical. That's a time when we can see evangelicals kind of re-emerging on the American scene, having been kind of scattered, feeling like they've lost their influence in the wake of the fundamentalist modernist controversies, the Scopes trial. By the early 40s, they come together and say, we're doing great things. We've got Bible schools, we've got churches spread across the country, but we need a bigger influence, right? Because the nation needs us. And so they come together in the National Association of Evangelicals, and they look to their kind of new leader, Billy Graham, this new celebrity evangelist. And this is the era where my story really kind of picks up. And it's during the Second World War, and then in the years after, the early Cold War. And it's this Cold War context in particular that's really important, because that's where we see Christian nationalism very formative. And understandably so, because it's an era really shaped by anti-communism, and communism was perceived to be anti-God, anti-family, and anti-American. And these are the values that evangelicals held most dear. And it was an active military threat. And so the defense of these values needed to be, in many cases, an active military defense. And in many cases, it was deemed the best defense is a good offense. And so we see this Christian nationalism actually merged together with conservative gender roles at that time as well, because there was such a military threat. There was a real emphasis placed on men as protectors and providers, but the protector was really critical. Now, in the book, I explain how this was not unusual. This is by the 1950s, right? This is the post-war baby boom. Family values were all the rage, at least with white middle-class Americans. This is the era of Cold War consensus. These were widely held values. And in fact, it's at this point that evangelicals do kind of reassert themselves. They have Eisenhower in the White House, right, inviting Billy Graham in, and they're really do position themselves close to the center of American culture and within reach of the centers of American power, just as they had planned, even just 10 years earlier. It's really quite remarkable. And things were going great until they weren't, until the 1960s. And it's in the 1960s that these more widely held values start to come under question. Values such as gender traditionalism with the rise of feminism. Also, we have the destabilizing effects of the civil rights movement, particularly destabilizing for the social order in the American South, where many white evangelicals happen to be located. So very disruptive there in terms of cultural and social authority. And then we also have the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement. And the anti-war movement in particular has a lot of Americans questioning both American goodness and American greatness, as reports of the atrocities on both sides end up being filtered back through the evening news into people's living rooms. What happens is a lot of Americans start to question all of these quote unquote traditional values, and evangelicals really double down. And it's at this point that evangelicals actually are kind of coalescing as not just a religious, but also increasingly as a partisan political movement. And this is right during the time that we see a partisan realignment. And so the values that they hold dear, which include things like stark gender difference, so anti-feminism, also include militarism in terms of US foreign policy, come together to really define the identities of white evangelicals more broadly. And this is very much an oppositional identity, right? Rather than just being at the center of things, they very much perceive themselves to be in opposition to many other Americans, and therefore as the faithful remnant, as this critical force who will preserve American goodness and greatness by preserving American Christianity and orthodoxy as they understand it, and preserving American power. And that's where preserving this kind of masculine strength is and aggression is a part of that plan as well. So anyway, I tell that story in the book and weave together religion, culture, and politics throughout. But one of the things that I do in this book is describe how important popular culture is to the formation of evangelical identity, how important consumer culture is. Because when evangelicals had a plan to reach across the nation and to reassert their influence, they wanted to do so through alliances and networks. They said, look, we've got all this great stuff going on. We need to form networks. We need to form organizations that connect us all. And we need to take control of popular culture. We need to take to the airwaves. Radio is going to be hugely important, and then eventually television. We need Christian bookstores in every city and town. We need distribution networks. We need Christian publishing. We need magazines with tens of thousands of subscribers. And they do it all with remarkable success. And so in the book, I describe how this, when we understand evangelicalism today, we have to think much less in terms of any denominational or organizational boundaries, and much more in terms of this popular culture and distribution networks, which means that this popular evangelicalism can travel far beyond quote unquote evangelical churches, deep into the mainline, deep into the Christian Reformed Church, deep into the RCA, through things like Christian radio, Christian publishing, and so forth. So that's one of the themes I talk about in the book. I then bring the book up decade by decade. One of the more interesting eras, to me, at least as a historian, is the 1990s. That's when in the 1990s, the Cold War has come to an end, and there's a lot of questioning of what should we do politically? What should we do in terms of gender roles? This is when we have the Promise Keepers movement. This is when we have a lot of cultural confusion and a lot of openness of maybe egalitarianism is the way, maybe focusing on global poverty and justice issues. It's this kind of bubbling up of new possibilities. By the end of that decade, the pendulum starts to swing back. a reassertion of more conservative and more militant conceptions of both Christianity and American power. And you can absolutely see this in terms of evangelical popular culture, in terms of books that are being published, and books that are on the shelves of Christian bookstores on September 11, 2001. Books like John Eldridge's Wild at Heart, James Dobson's Bringing Up Boys, and the like, which are calling for a return to a more militant culture wars Christianity and a more militant foreign policy and more militant conceptions of masculinity as well. So that's the story that I tell, and I continue to bring it actually up to the present, showing how in many cases ideals that were packaged and sold as biblical, things like complementarianism, things like Christian America, things that were just part of the air that many conservative evangelicals breathed for generations, were in fact products of particular historical and cultural moments, and really need to be understood in that light. At any rate, that's the story I tell, and apply it in particular ways to the last half century or so of faith and politics as well. So the book published in this last summer, and it has created quite a conversation because it ended up being published in the midst of what some people like Ed Stetzer, who I understand was with you earlier in the series, has called an evangelical reckoning. Because right now, the American church in particular, and the American evangelical church especially, is involved in this questioning of their deep divides that have been opened up, divides that were there longer than just the last 4 years, but had been papered over for a long time by using by politeness and by using common language that might mean very different things. Divides about what it means to be a faithful Christian. What does it mean to be a faithful Christian and engage in politics? What are Christian values when applied to the political realm, right? You know what I'm talking about, that these differences run very deep. And what we have happening right now is within churches and within families, people looking at each other across this divide, thinking, how can you hold those beliefs? And this goes both ways, right? Yeah, this is not what I meant by that. This is, I didn't, we're on very different pages. People leaving churches, pastors leaving churches, all right, people getting fired because they're realizing that, that these differences do in fact run so deep. So this is the cultural moment that my book entered into. Also, a church that was recently opened to confront a longer history of abuse, abuse within their own organizations, within their own communities. And that is absolutely a theme that I address in this book as well, how particular evangelical teachings and practices have cultivated a culture that leaves certain people vulnerable to abuse. And so that's the moment that the book entered into. The response to the book thus far has been really, really intriguing. Within a couple of days after the book published last June, I started getting letters from readers, and I still receive several a day. And so it's been hundreds and hundreds in the last 9 months. Almost all of these are from evangelicals themselves, and almost all of them say some version of a couple of things. This is the story of my life. And then they'll give me many paragraphs telling me exactly how it is, how their life histories map onto the history that I tell in Jesus and John Wayne. Again, this is a study of popular evangelicalism, so it tends to connect to people's lived experience. But also, I had no idea how all these pieces fit together. I had no idea what I was actually participating in, what I was actually complicit in. And I think the book is giving people words to articulate some of the unsettledness that they have felt in terms of questioning how their biblical values do in fact map onto the social and political values of conservative white evangelicalism. So I've been getting a lot of that response. And so I've been having a lot of conversations in the last 9 months with evangelicals, evangelical leaders, with folks in the Christian Reformed Church, RCA, to kind of wrestle with this. And I've been asked a lot by the media about this evangelical reckoning. And actually talked with Ed Stetzer about this in conversation as well. And a couple of takeaways that I'll share with you before we turn to a broader conversation is that I think this evangelical reckoning, such as it is a good thing in many ways. A lot of people are lamenting division within the church. I think that the church was already deeply divided, particularly if we bring in divisions around race and nation. And so this need not be a sign of greater division. It could be a painful step towards more unity. I think it's always a good thing when individual Christians and Christian organizations and institutions take a deep look at their own values, at their own actions, and at the scriptures together. And the more critical eyes that we can have, the better for us to look at the scriptures anew and ask if we are living faithfully according to these teachings. And so for me as a historian, I bring the critical historical lens. There are many lenses that we can bring to that conversation. So the individual reckoning is real, and I think it's healthy, even if it can be painful. What I will say is the institutional reckoning is not happening as much at all, if at all. In terms of right now, I think that there are many individuals who are shifting not their core beliefs, but how they apply those beliefs in terms of social policies and so on, or even in terms of their general posture. Many evangelical organizations are not shifting, I think, for a variety of reasons. One reason is fear. And another is more comfort with the status quo, and there's usually some combination. So I think that there are many churches and organizations right now that are holding together some pretty deep divisions. There's also a culture of deference within white evangelicalism, within white Christianity generally, to submit to your proper authorities and to not rock the boat, not disrupt the witness of the church, the ministry of the organization. That those are all can be very good impulses. It's something I describe, but I also describe how in many cases that can also lead to very abusive contexts. And so those are dynamics that I see very much continuing. So right now there's a really interesting sorting out happening between, I think, on an individual level and much more reluctance on an institutional level, a fear of losing donors, subscribers, and so on. And so I think there's a lot of unrest right now in many denominations, including those represented here today, I think, and across American evangelicalism. So it's a very dynamic time. It's a very unsettled time. I'll say one final word about, as much as I focused on the US here, because that's my area of expertise, I will say I've been having a lot of conversations with Canadian Christians as well, Canadian evangelicals, Canadian members of the CRC, just talking about possibly doing an online event in coming weeks or months with Sarah Bessie, other Canadian evangelicals, to have this conversation, because what I'm hearing is that the situation is quite different in terms of Christian nationalism, in terms of the longer history. But because the evangelicalism that I describe has largely been distributed through this popular culture, that popular culture crosses borders. It's, I think somebody just called it the kind of imperial popular evangelicalism, right? It just crosses these borders. It colonizes Canadian evangelicalism. And so these influences, although the setting is different, these influences are very powerful within the Canadian church as well. Since the book has come out and it got a lot of international coverage as well, I've heard from Christians in Australia, many in Brazil, in the Netherlands, in Germany, in China, in Kenya, all of them sharing their stories of how these writings and this popular culture has also colonized the global church in their locations with many similar effects, including in some cases cultivating abusive cultures and even sexual abuse in Christian organizations and institutions. And so I'm trying to figure out how to work together with evangelical and Christian leaders globally to kind of pool our resources and work to address some of the problems that this creates, address some of the root problems, and really participate in using global networks to participate in renewal efforts globally as well. So that's what I see happening in the church today. There are a lot of very important conversations taking place that I think we need to be having. And our real challenge is to have those in deeply informed ways and in deeply respectful ways, but also in deeply honest ways.
Thank you, Kristin. Appreciate that very much. We're populating questions here, but I want to start here. So going back to the abusive culture piece, Amy Bird, for those of you who know Amy, sent a letter, kind of an open letter out to her denomination in the past week, talking about the abusive situations and so on. What couple of pieces of advice do you have for church leaders as they seek to face a past and face a present that may lead into kind of abusive actions?
Yeah. This is really important. I think there's so much that could be said here. Be brutally honest with yourself. I mean, if you're leading an organization, you should expect to find or not be surprised to find abusive behaviors. Hopefully you won't, but rather than the opposite of it can't ever happen here, right? That's really important. Educate yourself as much as possible. There are all kinds of resources out there, and our denominations have resources, but really to understand how this isn't just about, good people or bad people, but it is about the institutional context that allow for bad things to continue to happen. And again, the things that the patterns that I discovered throughout researching this book were particularly this culture of deference, of how you do not disrupt, and if there is a problem, you cover it up. Right? You make it go away very quietly, or you don't even make it go away. You just hope it doesn't happen again, right? That is the absolute worst thing to do. All of our instincts are to cover, right? To protect the church, protect the organization, protect that leader, protect his family. There's so much protection going on. In the long term, that is the worst possible thing to do. So we need to be open and confront abuse, and then we need to set up cultures where that doesn't happen, institutional cultures, church cultures, which means loving and respecting our leaders, but not showing undue deference, and not assuming that just because they're nice to us means that they can't possibly not be, right, to everybody. And so there are just many kind of best practices that we can put into place. And then also just use the resources that are out there. Don't try to make it up as you go along. So use the church resources, and whenever necessary, if we're talking any sort of sexual abuse, immediately contact law enforcement, no matter what.
Thank you. Someone here is referencing Charles Colson, and obviously he had a huge role in the evangelical world in the 80s, 90s, and a little bit beyond that. They're kind of wondering how he fits into the things you're talking about today.
Yeah. He gets a couple of mentions in my book. Could have a lot more. I know I grew up I got one of his books for graduation as was done at the time, and from the Christian bookstore down the street. He's kind of seen as this because of his prison fellowship ministry, as this shining example of kind of justice-oriented Christianity, compassionate conservatism. In fact, he also was kind of a ringleader in the religious right and in perpetuating many of the the policies, and more than that, the posture that comes under critique in this book. So a more complicated history with Colson. He had a seat at the table many times within the power structures of the religious right. So he's very much in the thick of this, and I could have written much more on him in this book.
Thank you. So obviously we've switched administrations from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. And someone's just kind of curious here how you see what you wrote about in your book as how now many evangelicals are interacting with or responding to the Biden administration.
Mm-hmm. I think that there's just much less of a response because there's much less of a sense of ownership or connection there. And so, I've seen many of the evangelicals who came out and supported Biden over Trump, so kind of this progressive isn't the right word, but anti-Trump cohort who spoke in opposition to Biden. What was it? Was it on the Hyde Amendment, perhaps, conversation? So how could you, we supported you. And so that's actually a really, really healthy thing, right? We need whichever side you choose, we need to have much, much, much more of that. Not like we're with each other through thick and thin. Say, I'm going to give you my vote, but I'm going to absolutely hold you accountable at every single turn, right? And so I see some of that. I see, continued a lot of opposition. Certainly to Biden from more conservative circles, a lot of opposition to the current administration's policies on a wide array of issues. So, but it's absolutely less intense because of the much closer connection, obviously, between at least 81% of white evangelicals and the Trump administration. So for me, it's kind of a little bit of a breather because it's not something that white evangelicals are in the news every single day with respect to the current administration. But yeah, I think we're in a slightly healthier place, and what we really need is whoever is in the White House, the evangelicals can approve certain things and vehemently oppose other things. That's a much healthier relationship.
So Pete's wondering about the reckoning we're talking about around the purity culture of the 1990s, all those pieces that go along with that. And yeah, just talk about that in terms of, again, the purity culture, the sexual ethic, possible abuse connections.
Yeah, this is just a great example of, where it's not that there aren't any biblical teachings as part of this purity culture, but there's a lot of other stuff that gets layered on top of kind of biblical teachings about sexuality. And I spent a lot of time in my book looking at this and at teachings on sexuality, pre-purity culture and through the purity culture. Some of the more disturbing trends that I saw, pervasive trends, were, teachings of masculine or male sexuality as naturally, testosterone fueled, and therefore like almost uncontrollable lust. That's just boys will be boys. That's how God created them. So it's up to women to protect virtue through modesty if they're not married, and through fulfilling their husband's every sexual need if they are married. And if this sounds a little crazy, like trust me, read some evangelical sex manuals, or don't. But trust me, it's like pervasive in really disturbing ways that does actually set women up for abuse and for the inability to identify abuse. There's a new book out called The Great Sex Rescue that is this massive study of evangelical sex advice literature. And the author and I actually end up coincidentally quoting some of the greatest hits from this literature because the themes are just so pronounced. So purity culture then builds on that kind of gender difference, shame, and also the teachings of kind of, absolute purity versus like total ruin for women in particular. I've always thought that's so not reformed, right? None of us are perfect. None of us are pure. Our sexuality, whether we've had sex or not, is fallen, and we need to start in a different place. And I don't know, as a Reformed Christian, as a Calvinist, that's just never made a lot of sense to me. But what we have now is a generation or two who have grown up in that culture, who were taught that like way out of proportion to how they were taught the scriptures, how they were taught to be global citizens, or, to love their neighbors. Like youth group was a lot of sex stuff. Josh Harris, I kissed dating goodbye, right? This just permeated evangelical youth culture. And a lot of people took it really, really seriously, and they kind of shaped their lives and then their marriages around this. And then it all kind of came crashing down. So right now we're in the middle of a kind of mass rejection, a lot of bitterness, a lot of resentment. And so I think the challenge for the church is to allow that to happen, because these teachings are deeply unbiblical in many ways and harmful, without throwing out any biblical sexual ethic, right? And that is a very, very hard line to walk. It actually reminds me of the research from my first book, which is on, looks at these debates around sexuality and Christianity and liberation in the 1920s. And there's this great group of female clergy women who are, it was a thing back in the 20s even, and they were looking at the flapper culture, and they're looking at these like male ministers who are just, like castigating these women for lipstick and, short skirts. And these women were awesome. They were like, you know what? Yeah, we're not fans of this either. But you know what? The sexual ethic that they're rebelling from, this sexual double standard of Victorian Christianity, was also deeply unbiblical. And so, you know what, let's just find a fresh place to start. And I think that that's probably a healthier place for the church, but it is a huge challenge right now to discover and pursue a sexual ethic that is not tainted by this recent past.
Thanks. So somebody's asking you to predict the future. So
scary for a historian. We always get it wrong.
Yeah, they say, how do you think future historians will look back on this evangelical sorting out or unrest? If you could predict the future, are you hopeful the church can come through it stronger, more representative? And what might we need to make that happen?
It's a really good question. My trust really is in God. And so I worry much less about the fate of the church than I do about other things like the fate of American democracy and things like that. Those things like worry me a lot more, because I think the church really is in God's hands, and the Spirit will work, and the Spirit can work through difficult times. In fact, that's usually when there is a kind of purifying or return to faithfulness. And so I'll start with that. But I don't know. The White Evangelical Church in particular has set up so many kind of boundaries. And I think that what is needed right now is to break down some of those boundaries. And I do see this a kind of resorting happening, a kind of rethinking what is orthodox and who is identified as excluded from our communities. Who have we excluded in the past, and on what basis? And again, racial barriers are huge here, but a number of other issues could very quickly get you defined outside of the fold. And if you're defined outside of the fold, particularly within a more kind of militant faith conception, then you're an enemy, right? You're against us. If you're not with us, you are against us. This is this militancy. And so I think it's a wonderful opportunity to have a new posture, to move beyond those boundaries, to spend time with Christians who are very different from us. And that means crossing racial divides, denominational divides, cultural divides, even, moral values divides, and to listen to each other and to seek unity. And I am actually hopeful that that good things can come out of this. But we need courage, and we need honesty, and we need grace. We need to give grace and receive grace. So cautiously optimistic, only because my trust is in the Lord, but it is an uncertain time right now.
Great. So a little bit of history here. What caused you to start the research? And to a certain extent, some people could say, well, you have an agenda. And so they might just dismiss your book because you have an agenda. And so just kind of curious, what got it started? And
Yeah. First of all, I'll let you in on a secret. All historians have an agenda, right? Like there's actually a book called The Objectivity Myth. Like we all get it. Like we all enter into our scholarship from our particular positions. And for me, that was not a radical notion when I, read the book in graduate school, because I had grown up shaped by Christian scholarship and Reformed teachings, that we all have a worldview, right? We all are approaching our scholarship in this case from that particular position. And so that's, yeah, we all have positionality. My students like to use the word bias, and that like has such negative connotations, but we all have positionality, and then we all have a purpose, right? We all have a purpose. We're all in history, you have a thesis, you have an argument, and you defend it. Now, you don't come up with that first. You first do a lot of research, then you put pieces together, and you gradually come back to it. In this book too, I went with a trade publisher, and one of the things that my editor made me do pretty late in the game actually was take all of my conclusions, all my concluding arguments that were in my conclusion. And he's like, yeah, you know what we're going to do with these? We're going to move them all right up to the front. They all go in your intro. So if you've read the book, you know, like you are just hit hard right up front in this book. And it's invigorating, but that was an editorial choice that was like hard for me to do. It felt wrong doing that. Like I worked 300 pages and a whole lot of footnotes to get to this point. And he's like, yep, move them right up. So he's like, and come up with something else for that conclusion. So anyway, that's that little story. So yes, there's an agenda, there's a position, there's a very clear argument, and the book is not hiding it. But I came to that not knowing that was going to be the argument of this book. This book actually originated more than 15 years ago, long before I ever dreamed that Donald Trump would be running for president. And it was actually Calvin students who brought it to my attention. This literature on Christian masculinity. I was teaching a class on Teddy Roosevelt, and afterwards, a couple of guys came up to me and said, Professor Dumais, there's this book you really have to read. And they showed me John Eldredge's Wild at Heart. And I opened it up, and sure enough, Eldredge starts his book by quoting Teddy Roosevelt and goes on to describe what I just taught about how masculinity can be linked to American power and militarism and religion and race and all these things. And like, oh my goodness, it's happening again. This was back in 2005, 2006. And I immediately saw connections between American evangelicals and US foreign policy, embrace of militarism, the Iraq War. That's when this started. I ended up setting the project aside for a time because I had other things going on and for a couple of other reasons. But it was in the fall of 2016 when I saw what was going on nationally that I realized this deeper history was relevant to our current moment. And that's when I took the old research and ended up turning it into this book.
For those of us who are historians, we love to hear the history of how things happen. So thanks for that.
It's a long history for a book, yeah.
So a curiosity here, somebody's looking back, I mean, the last, let's say from 1980, 1990, church planting has been a huge thing, church growth methods with Peter Wagner and all those kind of things, the missions. How does that add in, contribute, or shape what you're talking about?
Yeah, yes. Absolutely. And I've been talking with a lot of people who've been immersed in this and evangelical leaders, I mean, especially since this book came out. And so I'm not an expert. I could have researched that, especially now after these conversations. I think that could absolutely be, I have a lot of threads I'm pulling together, Jesus and John Wayne. I could have added that one. It would be fascinating. It'd be a lot easier for me to have done so if somebody writes first the history of that movement, really, a really good critical history. But here's what I've been hearing. So it's gonna be kind of broad brushstroke, but hopefully it's not too inaccurate. But I think there are certain affinities between certainly what I saw in the research I did was the equation of church growth with power and with doing God's will. And I mean, ultimately, Jesus and John Wayne is a book about power, right? It's a book about the relationship between Christianity and power. And that's really where the critique comes in. And that's the corrupted the faith part of what model of power are we working with? Is it a kind of worldly model, military power, assertive power, aggressive power, or what is the way of Christ? And with church growth, what I saw in my research was, people like Mark Driscoll or so who became, I mean, when you look at his teachings, that just incredibly misogynistic, militaristic, crass, and you think, how could this guy be a leader? Well, he was elevated as such a leader because he had grown his church so successfully, and he was reaching out through digital media, and he was held up as this guru of church growth and of leadership. And a generation of pastors like modeled their ministries after his example. And that's the kind of tendencies that I saw, this equation of success with earthly success, with power, with God's will. And then God-given authority. So that would be the framing that I would bring to any questions that I had, and then I'd have to do the research and see if that bears it out, or if I would have to shift that. But those are the questions I have, and from what I've been hearing.
Great. One last question, then we'll let you finish up with a few minutes for us. But you talked a little bit about this at the beginning with the CRC and RCA and whether we're evangelical or not, yes. But somebody's just kind of asking the question here, can deeply committed progressive Reformed Christians call ourselves evangelicals anymore, or do we need a new identifier?
Oh, everybody's making that decision on their own right now. It's really, I mean, it's an open question. I've written a lot on this, the definitional question in other spaces too. And it's an interesting question. I don't insist that there's one way to go about defining evangelicalism. In fact, I have a piece that got a lot of coverage a couple of years ago that basically evangelicalism is, there are no real evangelicals, only imagined evangelicals. Because right, we're creating this. It's right, riffing off of Benedict Anderson's imagined communities, that nationalism is imagined, which doesn't mean it's not real, but you imagine, right, this identity, and then you make it real. And so I said, we need to be much more attentive to who is doing the imagining, who gets to define evangelicalism, who gets to say if you are or you aren't. Is it Lifeway Christian Books that decides if you're an evangelical or not? Is it the National Association of Evangelicals? Is it Christianity Today? Is it George Marsden? Is it Kristin Dumais, right? Like we're all defining this, but who has more power to define and to make other people live into your definitions? So we can all define evangelicalism, and you can define evangelicalism and say, yes, I am, or no, I'm not, so progressive evangelicals for a long time, the Jim Wallace Sojourners types were insisting, yes, we are evangelicals, because we are not going to cede that beautiful word and all that it entails to conservatives. Now, very recently, I think they kind of gave that up, but and a lot of people too are giving that up because words change. Because now many people who are identifying as evangelical are in fact identifying with this cultural and political conception of evangelicalism rather than another one. But that doesn't mean that you have to totally give it up. Everybody's making that decision for themselves. But right now, if you are a progressive Christian who wants to hold on to that terminology, it's kind of rough out there. So you can keep trying. But then I'm always really curious too, though, like why that word? Why is that word so important to you instead of other words, including just, Christian? Or so I'm always curious what the motivation is, and they're fascinating conversations right now.
So what last few words do you have for us today, Kristin?
Yeah, I try not to get distracted by seeing all these interesting questions popping up in the chat.
There's a lot of good stuff coming up.
Right? So I think one of the things that there's so much that could be said for RCA and CRC churches in particular. I think that to be critical of, just aware of the ways in which our members are spiritually formed, right? How does spiritual formation happen? How does religious formation happen these days? And again, as a cultural historian, I tend to give a lot of power to popular culture and to consumer culture, and particularly to a religious consumer culture. Usually it's kind of been like, yes, we're influenced by secular culture, so we want to get rid of that, which is why we created this whole industry over here of, the evangelical subculture, the Christian subculture, and we have Christian music and we have Christian movies and all this stuff, and thinking that this was a good versus bad situation, instead of taking a careful look at what sort of biblical teachings were conveyed or were obscured through this Christian popular culture, through these popular books that line Christian bookstores, and that we give as graduation gifts. One of the more interesting observations, I think, from Jesus and John Wayne, I took from another scholar, this is what we do, footnote, Daniel Silliman, who has a book coming out this next year on Christian fiction, but he had already been presenting his research on Christian bookstores. And if you've read the book, you know, I talk about like the rise of the CBA, Christian Booksellers Association, and how they intentionally shifted from more theological and doctrinal writing because that would split the market, and you want mass market to make mass profits, right? And so you needed to water down any denominational differences, because Presbyterians don't want to read Lutheran theology. But the answer to that was Christian living, right? How to be a Christian wife, how to be a Christian husband, how to raise your kids. And so it's kind of flattening of theological specificity and theological substance to the Christian living market, and we kind of see where that's brought us. So for a denomination like the RCA or the CRC, there is a rich, distinctive tradition, including theological tradition, on which to draw. And that's not that that's the only good Christianity that there is, but there is a kind of ballast then that you can bring that into conversation with things that come your way. So that would be important. The other thing, two things I would say is, again, the need to cross boundaries, the need to listen to voices who are different from our own, to listen to people with very different experiences, particularly across race, nation, that we listen to brothers and sisters in Christ. And that we open ourselves to those conversations, and that we think about who we have excluded from our company, make amends where necessary, and think about who we have never even considered including. So I think that's a healthy practice. And then finally, I would say courage, that this is a time where we all need to be courageous, and we need to be courageous, not in an aggressive, militaristic kind of burn it all down way, but in a principled way. We need to speak truth to power, even when it makes us very uncomfortable. We need to speak truth to our neighbors. And again, this is not Facebook screeds kind of speaking truth at all. It is talking across difference, including to our own pastors, including to our own members of our churches. If you are a pastor, it means just having a lot more transparency, a lot more honesty, because I think that there's that things are not black and white. There's much more nuance. There is much more. We need to create space for that, for honest conversations, and much less in the way of litmus tests, much less in the way of defining people outside of the fold, or this us versus them mentality, and instead create spaces, trusting that God will hold us together in Christ, and that we can have these conversations that maybe are long overdue with one another.
Wonderful. Hey, thanks so much for being with us today. So great. And also appreciate your students who are supposed to be being taught right now, right?
So, yeah, sorry about that little chime. That was my, you should start your class right now chime. So yes, yeah. They have a reading day. They're very happy. It's a nice day for a reading day. Yeah.
That's good. Hey, and to all of you, thank you so much for being part of this. This is our last Church Now conversation as we walk into the spring, but want you to be aware and watching for something called Church Now Cafe that's going to take place over 2 days in August. And so watch for that coming out, and we'll get more information to you, and hopefully you can join us for a Church Now Cafe conversation. But again, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Kristin. Have a good rest of your day.